Jerry Ensminger served as a Marine for over 20 years. His daughter Janie died of leukemia at 9. Years later, he discovered why. The drinking water at Camp Lejeune had been laced with toxic chemicals since 1953. Up to 1 million people were exposed. Warnings were documented. The wells kept running. The dark secret behind this disaster isn't the contamination, it's who knew and how long they let it continue. Camp Lejeune covers over 150,000 acres along the coast of North Carolina. For decades, this massive base operated as a self-contained city, supplying drinking water to service members, families, and civilian workers. But beneath the soil, a toxic plume was spreading. Between August 1st, 1953 and December 31st, 1987, the base water system delivered 4 highly toxic industrial chemicals: trichloroethylene, perchloroethylene, benzene, and vinyl chloride. These are volatile organic compounds, liquids used in fuels and solvents that dissolve poorly in water and seep easily through soil into underground aquifers. At Camp Lejeune, laboratory tests later revealed these chemicals in concentrations that exceeded federal safety limits by hundreds of times. Because of the vast network of wells, as many as 1 million people are estimated to have lived and worked within this contamination zone. This does not mean everyone received an identical dose or faced the same health outcome, but the sheer reach of the pollution is unmatched. It leaves a fundamental question: why did officials allow these wells to pump water for years after the hazard was recorded on paper? The pollution reached the drinking supply through 2 distinct pathways. Just outside the base boundary, ABC 1-hour cleaners routinely discharged wastewater laden with perchloroethylene directly into storm drains. The solvent seeped into the shallow aquifer, creating a slowly moving underground plume of contamination that migrated toward the Tarawa Terrace well field. On the base itself, at Hadnot Point, a separate crisis developed. Decades of fuel handling, leaking underground storage tanks, and industrial solvent disposal saturated the local soil with trichloroethylene, benzene, and other toxic chemicals. These separate plumes converged beneath the base's water system, mixing together near the supply lines. Groundwater acted as an invisible conveyor belt, pulling these poisonous chemicals directly into the active wells. From there, the contaminated water was pumped straight into residential neighborhoods, military barracks, schools, and the base hospital. No visible spills, odors, or discoloration inside the homes ever warned the families. The entire exposure route was silent, underground, and mathematically traceable. The paper trail of warnings began on October 1st, 1980, when a Navy environmental unit conducted a priority pollutant scan across the base water systems. It was the earliest official detection of volatile organic compounds in Camp Lejeune's drinking supply. 5 months later, on March 9, 1981, an internal laboratory memo flagged the water at Hadnot Point as highly contaminated with chlorinated hydrocarbons. By May 1982, Granger Laboratories, a contracted testing facility, formally reported that solvent residues in the water were so concentrated they interfered with routine analysis. Over the next 2 years, instead of warning the residents or shutting down the pumps, base officials ordered more tests to verify the findings. In June 1983, Marine Corps environmental officials met with the North Carolina State Water Supply Agency. They assured state regulators that no environmental problems existed on the base, and they chose not to share the Granger reports. A later Government Accountability Office investigation described this delay as a professional difference of opinion among Navy managers over when to issue a notification. By July 1984, a systematic survey by the Naval Air Construction and Installation Program identified 12 contaminated wells. On November 30th, 1984, tests at Hadnot Point, well 602, revealed 1,600 parts per billion of trichloroethylene and 121 parts per billion of benzene. This reading is distinct from a separate historical peak of 1,400 micrograms per liter recorded in other government files, while 602 was taken out of service immediately. Between late November 1984 and February 8, 1985, officials removed 10 wells from regular rotation, 8 at Hadnot Point and 2 at Tarawa Terrace. Yet, despite these removals, internal logs show a discrepancy. Some of these contaminated wells were still used intermittently as backups to supplement low water levels. The finality came years later. The Tarawa Terrace plant was permanently shut down in March 1987, and the remaining Hadnot Point wells closed by the end of that year. In 1989, the Environmental Protection Agency placed Camp Lejeune on the National Priorities List, officially designating the military base a federal Superfund site. Marine supply specialist Jerry Ensminger lived with his family in the Midway Park housing area during his service from 1978 through 1985. In July 1983, his 6-year-old daughter, Janie, developed symptoms that led to a diagnosis of acute lymphocytic leukemia. For over 2 years, Janie underwent chemotherapy, spinal taps, and bone marrow aspirations at the base hospital before dying in September 1985 at just 9 years old. Years later, Ensminger uncovered government health assessments detailing the contamination, matching the timeline of his daughter's illness to the years they drank the base water. He began filing Freedom of Information Act requests, turning private grief into a systematic hunt for documents. Ensminger connected with other families who shared similar stories of rare cancers and birth defects, eventually co-founding the advocacy group The Few, The Proud, The Forgotten. While epidemiologic agencies studied population-level statistical associations rather than individual causation, the families demanded direct, institutional accountability. By 2007, Ensminger stood before a congressional committee, placing their personal tragedy and the documentation of institutional delay into the permanent federal record. Federal investigators began quantifying the human cost by tracking the most vulnerable. The Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry surveyed 12,598 parents of children born on the base between 1968 and 1985, uncovering a pattern of prenatal exposure. The study identified 106 severe health outcomes, 35 neural tube defects, 42 oral clefts, and 29 childhood hematopoietic cancers, specifically leukemia and non-Hodgkin lymphoma. For adults, broader reviews linked the solvents to increased rates of bladder, kidney, liver, and blood cancers. In 2009, the National Academies concluded there was moderate evidence linking the chemicals to several adult cancers and limited evidence for birth defects. Still, epidemiologic science only establishes group-level risk and statistical association, and it cannot provide definitive proof of causation for a single individual's illness. This medical puzzle is further clouded by a lack of data. Sparse historical sampling before 1984 forced researchers to rely on reconstructed monthly concentrations, preventing precise individual dose estimates. Aside from these cancers, potential neurological and neurobehavioral effects remain under active investigation, leaving the true scope of the disaster open-ended. For decades, the public record remained blank, filled by official denials and disputed explanations. On December 30, 2012, family pressure and scientific reviews forced a change in federal law. Congress enacted Public Law 112-154, the Janie Ensminger Act. The statute granted VA healthcare eligibility to veterans and family members who spent at least 30 days on the base between 1957 and 1987. Under this law, the government presumed exposure caused their illnesses, bypassing the requirement for individual medical proof. VA healthcare, however, did not grant a right to file a lawsuit. On August 10, 2022, the Camp Lejeune Justice Act was signed as part of the PACT Act, establishing a distinct legal remedy. This law gave exposed individuals a strict 2-year window, ending August 10, 2024, to file civil claims for damages in federal court. Unlike the presumptive VA pathway, these civil lawsuits require claimants to prove causation by a preponderance of the evidence. Decades after the first internal warnings, the names of Janie Ensminger and thousands of military families became written into federal law, opening the gates for federal claims. Today, the battle for Camp Lejeune is no longer in the well fields, but in the courtrooms. Yet for thousands, legal acknowledgement arrived far too late. This betrayal proves a chilling truth. The price of institutional silence is always paid in human lives. Share your thoughts below.